illustration of what the U.S. did was that the European Union proposed, quoting now, to provide some health aid, needed aid for health care. Well, the U.S. blocked it and had a reason. The reason was U.S. officials, I'm reading the New York Times, U.S. officials expressed concern that some of the money might end up paying nurses, doctors, teachers, and others previously on the government payroll, thereby helping to finance Hamas, which won the election. That was said with no shame, just sort of, normal. We don't like the outcome of elections. We punish the population. Natural. It's also natural that this goes on side by side with soaring rhetoric about our idealism, our commitment to democracy promotion, and so on and so forth. And no contradiction, which in a sense is natural too, because it's so consistent. Well, Israeli attacks picked up severely in the following months. By June, Israel had fired 7,700 rockets at northern Gaza. That's since its formal withdrawal in September. Now, on June 25th, an event occurred which sharply escalated the U.S.-Israeli attack. On June 25th, Hamas kidnapped an Israeli soldier on the border, Gilad Shalit. That led to a huge outcry in the United States, and in fact in Europe too. What a crime, capturing, you can't kidnap a soldier, capturing a soldier from an attacking army. Okay, maybe that's wrong, but there are worse crimes, like one committed one day before the capture of Gilad Shalit, namely the Israeli army invaded Gaza, kidnapped this time 2 civilians, a doctor and his brother, in Gaza City, and spirited them across the border, violation of international law, and they sort of disappeared somewhere into the Israeli prison system where nobody knows what goes on. But there are certainly hundreds, at least, of people with under what's called administrative detention, just kept there without charge. These 2 brothers, the Muammar brothers, have disappeared. That was one day before the capture of Gilad Shalit. And kidnapping of civilians is a far worse crime than capturing a soldier and attacking army. But the 2 events are treated quite differently. The capture of Shalit is a major international event. To this day, Israel puts it forth with the support of the United States and indeed Europe as a reason for refusing a political settlement. What about the kidnapping of the Muammar brothers? It was reported, about a couple of dozen words in the Washington Post, but it disappeared, which in a way is justified, because this is standard, regular Israeli practice. Over the preceding decades, they have repeatedly kidnapped civilians in Lebanon on the high seas, an act which is much worse than Somali piracy, killing them sometimes, bringing many of them to Israel, where they've been kept in prisons, or sometimes secret prison torture chambers, sometimes for decades, and held as hostages. Well, since that's regular practice, why care if they did it once again on June 24th? But of course, if Hamas captures a soldier of an attacking army, well, that's the world is coming to an end. That's again a typical illustration of Western racism. Our guys, if somebody else does something to us, it's our story. If we do much worse to them consistently for decades, it's a yawn. Well, in order to, let's go back to January 2006, I should say after the capture of Shalit, the attack on Gaza escalated very sharply. A huge attack, large-scale destruction, destroyed the power systems, the water systems, the sewage systems, and so on. But that was considered okay too after this outrage, which still today is put forth as the main reason for refusing a ceasefire and a settlement. Well, in order to overturn the election, the United States in Israel went farther. They armed a military force, paramilitary force, led by Fatah strongman Mohammed Dahlan, tough thug, whose task was to carry out a military coup in Gaza to overthrow the elected government. Well, that failed. Hamas preempted, and that led to new attacks and a strengthened siege. But also the U.S. and Israel didn't stop there. They began, a U.S. general was sent, General Keith Dayton, to train a paramilitary force with the help of Jordan, which would be the Fatah paramilitary force. And here we get back to Kerry. He gives a reason to explain why Israel now has a legitimate Palestinian partner. The reason is the Dayton-run paramilitary force, which he says is really good. In fact, he says the most important development to show Palestinian legitimacy. And our goal is, primary goal, he said, is to strengthen General Dayton's efforts to train Palestinian security forces to keep order in the West Bank and to fight terror. And then he says, recent developments have been extremely encouraging. During the invasion of Gaza, Palestinian security forces were largely successful in maintaining calm in the West Bank amidst widespread expectations of civil unrest. More has to be done, but we can help extending this force. To translate that into English, during the Israeli invasion of Gaza, it was expected that there would be protests in the West Bank. You know, it's the same country after all. But thanks to the U.S.-trained paramilitary forces, they were able to keep the population under control. And there was no expression of sympathy for the people being slaughtered in Gaza. And that's, as Kerry says, extremely encouraging, and we have to do more. The U.S. has a lot of experience in this. In fact, unique experience, goes back a century since the U.S. established the Philippine Constabulary to try to control the Philippines after invading it and killing a couple 100,000 people. There was a lot of unrest. But the U.S. did succeed in complicated, sophisticated measures to create a Philippine paramilitary force, which still pretty much runs the country. It's one of the reasons the country's kind of a basket case. It's a century later. And it's happened over and over. The National Guards in the Caribbean, Central America, the paramilitary forces in Colombia, which were responsible for huge atrocities in the last couple of decades. And in fact, the military forces themselves, which, for example, in Colombia, just cooperate with the paramilitaries, are part of them essentially. And other armies too. So we got a century of experience in how to control populations with collaborationist paramilitary and military forces. So we should be able to achieve it in the West Bank too, and that's for Kerry most encouraging. Includes his own experience in Vietnam, where the Saigon Army, it was such a force. Its task was to control the population and prevent them from achieving any form of self-determination. So yes, we're pretty good at that.